It was 1874 in the Montana Territory, and a whole town had turned on Clara Hale. They called her a murderer, all because she did not cry hard enough when her no-good husband died. Now pregnant and alone, she was running for her life through a blizzard. This is a story about finding strength when you have nothing left. It will make you wonder what you would do if the whole world decided you were guilty. You are going to want to hear how this one ends. The truth was, Clara had cried all her tears out long before Samuel died. She cried when he drank away their money, and she cried when his sorry friends stared at her with hungry eyes. So when he was found dead, all she felt was quiet. But in a town that needed a villain, her quiet looked like guilt. The whispers started small, then grew to shouts. It all came to a head the night a rock shattered her window. That is when she knew she had to run. She pushed on, but the blizzard had swallowed the trail whole. Her feet were numb stones, but a new pain, a deep grinding ache began in her back. Stopping meant freezing to death. Going back meant facing Samuel's family, who were screaming for blood over a worthless mine share she never wanted. Suddenly, a cramp seized her, hard and sharp. It was not the cold. It was the baby. The terror of the chase was bringing her child into the world weeks too soon. Panic rose in her throat. She could not have a baby out here in the open. Just then, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a wolf watching from the trees. That fear gave her a new surge of energy. Pushing over a small rise, she caught a scent on the wind. It was wood smoke. There, tucked against a rock face, was a small, solid cabin. To Clara, it looked like heaven itself. She stumbled and crawled the last few yards as the pains came harder and faster. She collapsed against the rough door, banging with her last bit of strength. "Help me," she croaked. The door swung open and a wall of heat hit her. A mountain of a man stood there, holding a rifle. He had a thick, dark beard and a jagged scar that pulled at one eye. He looked like a man who wanted to be left alone by the world. "Get back," he growled. Just then another wave of pain washed over Clara, and she cried out, clutching her belly. "Please," she gasped, "the baby is coming." The man, Elias Mercer, froze solid. He saw her belly and then the dark stains spreading on her dress against the snow. He slowly lowered his rifle. He had come to these mountains 7 years ago to escape trouble, and this woman was nothing but. But he saw the raw animal fear in her eyes, the look of a creature caught in a trap. He cursed under his breath, then grabbed her arm. "Get in," he said, pulling her inside. Elias kicked the door shut, and the roar of the wind died. The small room was warm, smelling of pine and coffee. Clara fell to the floor. "Not there," Elias barked, sounding more scared than mad. He quickly moved her to a chair by the hearth. The place was bare, the home of a man haunted by something. His bed was made with army precision. When Clara whispered for water, she saw his hands were shaking. This was a man who knew how to survive the wilderness, but he was completely lost now. "I am not a doctor," Elias said, his voice as tight as a new rope. A bad memory from the war flashed in his mind. Clara, fighting for breath, just told him she needed clean cloths and his help. He pushed the memory away. He took one of his few good shirts and ripped it into strips, pouring boiling water over them. When another pain gripped her, he laid warm furs on the floor by the fire. He helped her down, saying, "It is warm here." She whispered that he had to watch in case the baby was turned wrong. So he knelt beside her, his heart hammering. The sight was raw, but he did not look away. He saw the top of the child's head. "Push," he commanded. It was the only way he knew to take charge. Clara cried out and bore down, but her strength was starting to fade. "I cannot," she whispered, her body trembling with exhaustion. "You can," Elias told her, his voice hard as iron. "You did not walk through a blizzard just to die on my floor." His resolve gave her strength. With one final effort, the baby slid into his hands. A boy. For one terrible second, there was only silence. Elias cleared the baby's mouth and urged, "Breathe, darn you." A tiny cry answered him, growing stronger by the moment. He tied and cut the cord, then placed the crying infant in his mother's arms. All through the night, Elias kept busy. He kept the fire roaring and cleaned up the room. He poured her a cup of whiskey to steady her hands. He sat watch in a chair by the door with his rifle on his lap, like a man guarding something sacred. When dawn finally broke, the storm was over. Clara woke up weak, but she was alive, and she was holding her son. Shame washed over her. She had brought chaos into this man's quiet life. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias turned from the window, his face weary in the gray morning light. As he added a log to the fire, the flames lit up her arms. He saw the dark bruises shaped like fingers against her pale skin. He saw the faint scar on her cheek. He recognized the signs of a heavy, cruel hand. Clara tensed, waiting for him to ask, to judge her. But Elias said nothing about the marks. He simply nodded toward the pot of porridge warming on the stove. "Eat," he said gently. "You need your strength." His silence was the greatest kindness he could offer. In that quiet moment, his head snapped up. He was listening to something far away. A sound carried on the thin, cold air. The sound of men. Elias moved to the door, his face grim. "They are looking for you," he said. The metallic click of his rifle loading was loud in the small cabin. The smoke from the chimney had saved her. Now it had betrayed her, showing them right where to find her. The world she had run from was coming. Clara held her son tighter, knowing the peace she had found with this quiet stranger was about to end. Some folks whispered that Clara Hale was a killer. Down in Silver Creek, they said she pushed her own husband into a ravine, and all because she didn't shed a tear at his grave. Now she was a mother on the run, with a newborn son and a blizzard at her heels. This is a story about how sometimes the folks society throws away are the only ones who can save you. Stick around to see if two outcasts can find justice in a place the law forgot. Her savior was a man named Elias, a mountain recluse with a jagged scar on his face. He'd found her in the snow and brought her to his cabin. He warmed river stones by the fire to stop her shivering, moving with a quiet caution. "You are kind," Clara rasped. Elias just grunted. "I know how to keep livestock alive in a freeze. It is not so different." But when he looked at her tiny baby, his tough face softened with something like fear and wonder. He held the boy like he was made of glass, his scarred, calloused hand bigger than the infant's entire head. The snowstorm locked them in that tiny cabin for a week, forcing them into a strange, silent dance of survival. They gave each other space without a word, turning their backs for privacy that did not really exist. Finally, the silence had to break. Elias was cleaning his revolver when he looked at her. "I am not asking for your life story, Clara," he said, his voice low. "But if the law is coming up this mountain, I need to know why. A man does not chase a woman with a new baby through a blizzard over a small thing." Clara looked down at her sleeping son. "My husband was named Samuel," she began. "He was a mean man, drunk more often than not. When he died, the town expected tears. But I felt nothing but relief, and the other women saw it. They decided a widow who does not weep must be a guilty one. The sheriff found a torn button and said it was proof of a fight. He said I pushed him." Her voice was hard and clear. "I have no family to defend me, Elias. I was an easy person to blame." Elias nodded slowly, his eyes weighing her story. "A town always needs someone to blame," he said quietly. "It keeps them from looking at their own sins." Clara found her courage. "And you? What are you hiding from?" Elias paused, his gaze distant. "I testified against a rich man down in Wyoming. He burned out a family, and I spoke the truth. His friends turned it around on me. They called me a mad dog and ran me out of the territory. I came up here because the mountains do not care about a man's name." He met her eyes. "You should know, Clara. There is no law up here but the kind a man brings with him." A cold fear washed over Clara. "We are trapped," she whispered. Elias looked at the snow piling up against the window. "Winter is a good jailer," he said. "It will keep them out for now." As the days passed, a quiet rhythm formed between them. He chopped wood and hauled water. She mended his clothes and cooked their meals. An unspoken trust began to grow in the small spaces of their shared life, a fragile warmth in the middle of the frozen wilderness. One afternoon, the baby would not stop crying. His thin, sharp wails filled the cabin. Exhausted, Clara paced the floor with him. "Give him here," Elias said, taking the child from her arms. He sat in his rocking chair and laid the baby's stomach down across his forearm, patting his back with a steady, gentle hand. The crying stopped almost at once. The baby sighed and curled his tiny fingers around Elias's large ones. Elias froze, staring at the sight. A look Clara had never seen before crossed his face, washing away the hard lines of his past. In that quiet moment, watching this scarred and lonely man soothe her son, Clara knew they were more than just two strangers. They were the beginning of a family, and building a life together, right under the noses of those who wronged them, would be the best revenge of all. That night, Clara stood by the fire after the baby was asleep. She looked pale, with her hair braided loosely over one shoulder. She watched Elias working on his boots near the door. "Elias," she said softly. He glanced up. "Thank you." The words felt small. "You could have just left me there when the storm hit." Elias stared at her. The fire made her cheeks glow and her eyes look like gold. She wore one of his old flannel shirts, and seeing her in his clothes stirred something in him he did not like. He wanted things he had sworn off. He looked a little too long, and the silence grew heavy. He saw the pulse in her throat, the way she leaned toward him without even realizing it. He wanted to cross that room and touch her face. But then he remembered the bruises on her wrists and her dead husband. He shot up from his chair, making it scrape loudly on the floor. "I need to check on the horses," he said, his voice rough. He walked out into the cold, leaving her all alone by the fire. The next morning, Clara's heart was as heavy as the gray sky. "I feel dirty," she said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Elias was sharpening his axe, but the sound stopped. "Why?" he asked. She stared at the wall. "The way folks in town looked at me. Even before Samuel died, they looked at me like I was spoiled goods. Now I am a widow hiding out with a mountain man. I know what they are calling me. They think a woman alone is just waiting to sin." Elias put his axe down and walked over to her. He stood close and she could smell the pine on his clothes. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "a town's judgment is not the truth. It is just noise like the wind. You brought a baby into this world during a blizzard. There is nothing dirty about that. It is the purest thing there is." Clara looked up at him with tears in her eyes. He paused, then said, "We ought to do something with the afterbirth. I kept it frozen out in the shed. It is an old way. You bury it, give it back to the land. It marks the child's place in the world." Clara nodded, wiping her face. "Yes, I would like that." They went out behind the cabin where two big pine trees stood. Elias had already cleared a patch of ground. He dug a small hole in the frozen earth. He gently placed the afterbirth inside, not like it was waste, but like it was sacred. He covered it with dirt and 3 large stones. "This is his ground now," Elias said. "He belongs here," Clara cried, wrapped in a blanket against the wind. For the first time in a long while, she felt respected as a person, not a possession. Elias stood beside her, blocking the wind. Later that night, Elias spread a map on the table. "We need a plan," he said. "I know I am putting you in danger by staying here," Clara told him. Elias pointed a finger at the map. "When the pass clears in about 2 weeks, we can head west. There is a settlement there, a bigger one. And a real judge travels through there." "A judge?" Clara asked. "If we can tell your story to a real judge, we can get it written down as truth." She looked at the map, a mess of lines and rivers. "Will we make it?" Elias met her eyes. "I will get you there, Clara. I swear it." He did not want to leave his cabin, but he knew they would be found soon. A few nights later, Clara woke up burning with fever. Elias was by her side in an instant, his cool, rough hand on her forehead. "You are on fire," he said. He sat with her all night, cooling her face with water and walking the floor with the crying baby. In the darkest hour before the sun came up, Clara reached for him. Her small hand found his. "Elias," she whispered. He froze. He should have pulled away, but he did not. Instead, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. "I am here," he said. They just held hands in the dark, and it was an anchor in the storm. For that moment, they were two people holding back the darkness. The fever broke the next morning, but a new trouble started. Clara's milk was drying up from the stress. The baby's hungry cries tore right through her. "He is starving," she said, her voice full of panic. Elias checked their supplies. They had meat and flour, but no milk. "I have to go," he said. "Go where?" "There is a trading post about 20 miles east." "That is too far," Clara cried. "The snow is deep. I can trade for some goat's milk or canned milk. Something." He was already putting on his gun belt and heavy coat. "Please do not go," she begged. She was scared of him not coming back. "I have to," Elias said, looking at the hungry baby. "He will not last 2 days without food." She watched him ride off into the trees. The silence in the cabin felt heavier than anything she had ever known. She waited, pacing the floor with the crying baby, trying to give him little spoonfuls of water. Some folks think they can own the world and everyone in it. Caleb Hale was one of those men, and he was hunting Clara, a woman with nothing but a newborn baby and a secret he would kill to keep buried. This is the story of how she and a hardened mountain man named Elias decided to fight back. When Elias finally rode back into the clearing after 2 long days, Clara thought he was a ghost. He was slumped over in the saddle, his face scraped raw and his coat torn. He'd brought the supplies, but seeing him so broken, a white-hot anger shot through her. "You fool, man!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I don't care about the supplies. I care about you." The words hung in the cold air, and she realized the fear of losing him was bigger than any fear of the storm or the men hunting them. That confession changed everything. A few days later, Elias said, "You need to learn how to shoot." He stood behind her, his arms wrapped around hers to steady the heavy Colt revolver, his chest warm against her back. He was so close she could smell the gun oil and the wood smoke on him. Her heart hammered as his breath ghosted her ear. "Squeeze, don't pull," he murmured. The lesson was about survival, but it felt like something else entirely. By the end, she could hit the tree stump 50 yards away. But their small moment of peace was shattered in an instant. Elias walked toward the creek and froze. "Clara!" he barked. She ran to his side and saw them, hoof prints in the fresh snow. Not from some wild Mustang, but from shod horse, heavy and deliberate, a lot of them. They had circled the cabin. "They were here," Elias said, his voice grim as he touched the edge of a print. "While we were shooting." The snow was still crumbling. They had been there less than an hour ago. Their sanctuary was gone. "Go inside," Elias ordered, his hand already on his gun. "Pack our bags." Elias knew those tracks. They belonged to the Hale Ranch. He'd seen 3 of their riders sweeping the valley below, not searching, but hunting. When he told Clara, she sank onto a bench, her face pale. "They are Hales," he said. "They'll be here by tomorrow." "Caleb Hale won't stop," she said quietly. "Not until he sees me dead." Elias looked at her, confusion on his face. "Why?" he asked. "This is more than grief for a dead brother. This feels like hate." Clara looked down at her sleeping baby and finally told him the whole ugly story. "It is hate," she said. "It started the day her husband, Samuel, brought her home. The Hales saw her as trash from the city, only after their money. The real sin, though, was that she had refused Samuel's older brother, Caleb. He had come to her when she was alone, put his hands on her, and said a woman like her must be lonely. "I told him I'd cut his throat if he ever touched me again," she said, her voice shaking. Caleb had laughed, called her filth, and said she should be grateful a Hale would even look at her. When Samuel died, Caleb saw his chance. If he could brand her a killer, no one would ever have to know she had rejected him. Elias listened, his jaw tight. "It's pride," he said softly. "I know how that song goes." He told her how he'd been run out of Laramie 10 years ago, beaten and jailed for standing up to a rich man's nephew who was whipping a stable boy. The law protected the powerful, and it had branded Elias a drifter and a dangerous man. He looked at her, the distance between them gone. "They make us into monsters so they don't have to look at themselves." They knew they couldn't stay. They spent the afternoon hauling flour, dried meat, and blankets to a hidden cave up on the ridge. The work was brutal in the thin, icy air. Back at the cabin for one last load, Elias froze. A horse snorted, loud and terrifyingly close. He shoved Clara toward the corner of the room. "Hide," he hissed, pointing to the loose floorboards. There was no time to run. The hunters were right outside their door. That old cabin floor had a few loose boards for a reason. Elias had himself a small root cellar under there to keep his potatoes from the frost. He told Clara, "Get in, and don't you make a peep." Clara scrambled, pulling the heavy iron stove just enough to the side. A surge of fear gave her a strength she did not know she had. She heaved up the floorboards, revealing a dark hole that smelled of dirt and onions. She slid down, holding that baby so tight, just praying he would stay quiet. Elias set the boards back, kicked a rug over the spot, and tossed a pile of wolf pelts on top for good measure. Then he grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch. Not 10 yards off, a man sat on his horse. He was a big fella with a red beard, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat. A tarnished badge was pinned to his vest. Afternoon, the writer said with no warmth in his voice. Afternoon, Elias replied, his own voice flat as the prairie. You're Mercer, the man stated. Elias just nodded. I'm Deputy Carson. We're on the hunt for a woman, a widow named Clara Hale. Elias said, I ain't got no neighbors, as you can plainly see. Carson spit tobacco juice that stained the snow a nasty brown. Heard you bought milk at the junction. A man alone don't have much use for milk. I've got a stomach ulcer, Elias lied, smooth as creek water. Doctor's orders. Carson let out a dry, barking laugh. You got a name around here, Mercer. Folks say you're touched in the head. Dangerous. I just think you're a man with something to hide. He nudged his horse closer, the hooves crunching in the snow. That woman's a killer. Smashed her husband's head with a rock. She's carrying a child that ain't even his. The Hale family wants justice. Elias's finger rested on the trigger of his Winchester, but he never flinched. If she broke the law will handle it, but she ain't here. Carson eyed the cabin, the smoke from the chimney, the woodpile. If I find you're lying, Mercer, I'll burn this place to the ground with you inside it. Helping a fugitive is a hanging offense. Get off my land, Elias said, his voice low and final. Carson sneered and turned his horse. We'll be back, he hollered, and we won't be asking so nice next time. Elias watched him disappear into the woods, waiting a long 5 minutes before he bolted back inside. He threw the pelts aside and tore up the floorboards. Clara, he called. A trembling hand reached up and Elias hauled her out. She was covered in dust, her eyes wild with fright. The baby, silent until now, let out a wail as the cool air hit him. Clara stumbled against the table, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. I heard him, she whispered. He said I killed Samuel. In 2 long strides, Elias was across the room, grabbing her by the shoulders. The tight control he held onto for weeks just snapped. Look at me, he commanded, his voice a rough shout. Clara looked up, stunned. He's a liar, Elias said, his voice fierce. He's just a dog barking for his master. I don't care what he said. I only care that you're still breathing. His grip was hard, almost painful, but in his anger, Clara felt safer than she ever had. I wanted to kill him, Elias growled. When he said your name, I wanted to put a bullet right through his chest. He let her go and turned away, running a hand through his hair. He was shaking too. Clara watched the tension in his broad back as he leaned against the wall. Elias, she said softly. She confessed, I've never felt safe. Not with my father, not with Samuel. I thought men were just creatures that hurt you. She took a small step toward him. But when you stood on that porch and lied for me, he turned around slowly, his eyes dark and stormy. I haven't let anyone get close, Clara. Not since the war. Not since the prison. I figured I'd just fail them. He looked at her then, truly looked past the fear and the dirt. I'm failing you now, he said. They found us. No, Clara said, reaching for his hand. His skin was rough but warm. You're the only reason I'm alive. The air in the little cabin changed. The fear seemed to pull back, leaving just the two of them in the firelight. Clara saw the lonely man beneath the scars, and he saw the steel backbone holding up a woman with a bruised soul. He stepped closer, drawn by something stronger than thought. Clara, he breathed, cupping her face in his big hands. She leaned into his touch and tilted her head up. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was desperate and raw, a collision of 2 souls starving for a little kindness. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her in as if he could piece them both together. She clung to his shirt, anchoring herself to his strength. For one perfect moment, nothing else existed. Then, from a crate by the fire, the baby cried out. They broke apart, stunned. Clara stumbled back, her hand to her lips. I'm sorry, she stammered. I shouldn't have. Don't, Elias said, his voice hoarse. Don't you dare apologize. He walked over to the baby's crate, trying to catch his breath, while Clara sank into a chair, her heart pounding a wild rhythm against her ribs. Her husband Samuel had been in the ground just 2 weeks. Now she was a widow and a mother, running for her life with a stranger. She felt a wave of guilt, stealing this man's warmth and safety. This is wrong, she whispered to Elias. I'm bringing you ruin and disrespecting my husband's memory. Elias turned, his face like stone. The dead are dead, Clara. They don't get to own the living. Samuel is gone, but you're here fighting for that boy. There's no shame in wanting help while you do it. He knelt before her. But we can't stay here. They'll burn us out. What do we do? She asked. We stop running, Elias said, his voice hard. Running only makes us prey. It's time to hunt back. I know a traitor, Silas Blue. He knows which judges are honest. We find him, we find a judge. They spent the night packing, leaving the cabin just as they found it, a silent goodbye to their sanctuary. At dawn, the cold air bit at their faces. Elias helped Clara onto her horse and handed her the bundled baby. She looked down at the small cabin one last time. It was a place of pain, but also of rebirth. I'm ready, she said. They rode north, the snow so deep it brushed the horses' bellies. By noon, they saw steam rising through the trees. Near the hot springs, a man stepped out of the mist. He was weathered and wore a heavy blanket coat. Elias, the man called, his voice rough. I figured that was you coming. Trouble's got a certain smell to it. Elias swung down from his horse. Silas, he said, I need your help. Silas looked from Clara to the baby, then spat. Looks like you got a wagon full of it. Over bitter pine needle tea, Elias told him everything. When he finished, Silas stared at Clara. You think Caleb Hale is chasing you because you bruised his pride? Clara nodded. He's a greedy man, Silas corrected, pulling out a worn ledger. I trade in news, not just furs. I was in Silver Creek 3 days ago. The Hales are buying up mining claims. All but one, the Silver Queen. That was Samuel's, Clara said. It was a dry hole. Silas shook his head. That's the story they told. But right before Samuel died, an assayer found a vein of silver in that mine as thick as your arm. The truth landed like a punch. Samuel didn't know? Elias asked. Maybe he did, Silas said grimly. And maybe that's why he ended up dead. The law says his property goes to his wife and child. It all clicked into place. They weren't just trying to shame her. They were trying to rob her son. They want the mines, she whispered. They want the deed, Silas confirmed. And if you're convicted of murder, the state takes the land. Then the Hales can buy it for pennies. Elias got to his feet, his face dark with fury. This isn't about prejudice, it's about business. He looked at Clara, his voice low and dangerous. We're not running to any river. We're going to find that assayer, and then we're going to find a judge. Silas stood too. The circuit judge is in Majestic City, 2 days' ride across open country. We'll cross it, Elias said. He gently adjusted the baby's blanket. We're going to get back what's yours, Clara. They rode away from the springs, no longer running for their lives. They were going to war. Getting down from the mountains was a battle against the land itself. The wind was relentless, stinging their faces until they were numb. 3 days later, they reached the Snake River. It was a churning mess of gray water and chunks of ice. There was no bridge, only a treacherous crossing Elias knew. He looked at the far bank, his jaw set. Clara clutched her crying baby, terrified. It's too deep, she shouted over the roar. It'll be deeper tomorrow, he yelled back. We go now. He tied his horse's lead rope to hers. Keep your eyes on the trees on the other side. Don't look down. The icy water was a shock, rising quickly up their legs. The current pulled hard, and Clara's horse stumbled on a slick rock. She cried out as the water surged over her thigh, but a fierce instinct to keep her son dry made her haul on the reins and find her balance. Elias's powerful horse pulled them through the worst of it. They scrambled onto the far bank, shaking and soaked. Before Clara could stop shivering, Elias had a fire blazing against the wind. We can't stop long, he said, handing her a piece of dried beef. He ate standing, his eyes constantly scanning the trail behind them. For 2 more days, they pushed on, sticking to thick woods that hid their trail. Finally, they rode into a settlement called Oak Haven. It was just a muddy main street lined with a few buildings, but it was the first town Clara had seen in a year. The feeling was different here. In the mountains, she was a survivor. In this town, she was a spectacle. People stopped and stared at the wild-looking woman, the scarred man, and the baby. They saw an outcast, not a mother fighting for her son's life. Model. In town, folks stared and whispered. Their judging eyes tried to strip Clara of what little dignity she had left. Look at her, one woman muttered loudly, running with that wild man and a baby too. Shameful. Clara held her head high, but her cheeks burned. Pay them no mind, Elias said low. They're just sheep. At the general store, the shopkeeper's smile vanished when he saw Elias. We're closed, he said flatly. Doors open, Elias replied. We need grain and some milk. I said we're closed, the man repeated. I know who you are, Mercer, the one who burned down that barn in Wyoming. I don't serve your kind. He looked Clara up and down. And I don't serve your women neither. The air went cold. Elias took a step forward, his hand drifting toward his gun. Elias, Clara said sharply, putting a hand on his arm. He stopped, his eyes like ice. Your loss, he said, and turned them both around, walking straight out. Outside, a young deputy was waiting. Move along, Mercer, he said with a smirk. We don't want your trouble here. We're here to see the doctor, Elias said. Is that against the law? Depends, the deputy sneered. They want you to get angry, Clara said quietly as they walked toward the doctor's house. They want a reason to call it justice. I know, Elias said, his jaw tight. Reputations are cages, Clara. Once they lock you in, they throw away the key. But Dr. Thorne, a man with shaky hands and kind eyes, looked past the rumors. He saw a sick baby who needed help, and for the first time that day, someone saw them as people, not problems. He examined Clara in the back room while Elias paced in the front like a caged animal. The doctor asked Clara to lower her dress so he could check her ribs. He saw the old bruises and the way her bones had healed crooked. He saw the scars. These are not from a fall, the doctor said quietly. No, Clara said, staring at the wall. My husband. He twisted my wrist. The doctor wrote everything down in a big leather book. He did not ask for the whole story. He just wrote down the facts. He wrote about her old broken bones and the marks that showed she had tried to defend herself. This book, Clara asked, will it hold up in court? The doctor looked at her. It is a medical record, madam. It is the truth of the body. The body does not lie. He gave her a piece of paper with his findings written on it. Keep this, he said. When they left the doctor's office, people were watching from their windows. We need a place to stay, Clara said. Elias shook his head. No hotel will take us. But there is a boarding house run by a widow named Hatcher. She only cares about money, not gossip. Mrs. Hatcher was a sour woman who took their money and gave them a small attic room. It had one iron bed. I will sleep in the stables, Elias said. No, Clara told him. Elias looked at her. Clara, people are already talking. Let them talk, Clara said, feeling a fire in her chest. They have already made up their minds about me. I will not sleep alone in a freezing room while you sleeping in a barn just to make them happy. Elias thought for a moment, then nodded and bolted the door. That night, Elias sat by the window, on edge from all the town noises. It brought the war back to him, the feeling of being trapped. Elias, Clara whispered from the bed, come away from the window. He turned, his face pale with sweat. I cannot breathe in here, he said. It is too close. Clara got up and walked over to him. Clara took his trembling, cold hand. Hey, you look at me, she whispered, guiding him away from the window and into the warm circle of the lantern's light. She pressed his hand flat against her chest. I am right here. You are with me now. Elias let out a long, shaky breath, the panic in his eyes finally starting to fade. You are the only real thing in this whole sorry town, he said. The tension that had simmered between them finally boiled over. It was not a seduction, but two people holding on for dear life. He pulled her close and kissed her, a vow against a world set to burn them down. They fell onto the narrow bed, careful not to wake the sleeping child as the darkness outside held its breath. Morning arrived with the thunder of heavy boots on the stairs and a pounding that shook the doorframe. Open up in there, Sheriff Rakes, a voice boomed. Before the second knock, Elias was dressed and had his revolver in hand. He stood back from the door, his pistol aimed steady. It is open, he called out. Sheriff Tom Rakes filled the doorway, a mountain of a man with two deputies behind him, both holding shotguns. Put that iron down, Mercer, Rakes said, or they will cut you in half. At Clara's trembling plea, Elias slowly lowered the gun. Rakes stepped in, a satisfied sneer on his face. Clara Hale, he said, I have a warrant for your arrest, murder. A deputy grabbed her arm as the baby began to scream. Elias lunged forward, a blur of motion, but Rakes was quicker. He swung his heavy pistol, cracking it across Elias's temple. Elias dropped to the floor, blood pouring from the gash. "Elias!" Clara screamed, fighting him with everything she had. But they were too strong. They dragged her down the stairs and threw her into a damp stone cell, taking the baby from her arms. "No," she shrieked, throwing herself against the bars. "Give him back to me." Rake stood just outside the cell, holding the crying infant. "You want this brat back?" he asked. "Then sign this." He held up a folded paper. "It is a confession. Says you pushed Samuel in a fit of rage. You sign it, plead guilty, and maybe you get 10 years instead of the rope." Clara looked at her son's red, distressed face. Every instinct screamed for her to save him, to sign the paper. But she remembered the bruises, the fear, and Elias bleeding on the floor. Signing it meant letting the men who hurt them win. She stood up tall, gripping the cold iron bars. "No," she said, "I will not sign a lie." He expected a scared little girl, but he was looking at a woman made of iron. "You're making a big mistake," Sheriff Rakes warned her. Just then the office door flew open. A sharp voice cut through the air. "Sheriff, I do believe you're holding my client without a lawyer." Rakes whipped around. In the doorway stood a tall man in a black coat, leaning on a silver-tipped cane. It was Judge Sterling. Next to him, swaying with his head wrapped in a bloody bandage, was Elias. But it was the third fella that truly mattered. A small, nervous man with ink-stained sleeves stood behind them. It was Arthur Penn, the clerk from the mining office. "Judge," Rakes stammered, "I was just talking with a hostage?" Sterling's eyes fell on the baby in the sheriff's arms. "A hostage? Give that child back to his mother, now." Rakes hesitated for a second, then passed the baby through the bars. Clara grabbed him and fell onto the cot, rocking him fiercely. Elias took a shaky step forward, looking like death itself. "We found him," Elias rasped, pointing at the clerk. "Tell him, Arthur." The little clerk trembled. "I have the ledger," he squeaked. "What ledger?" Rakes barked. "The payroll ledger from the Blackwood mine. It shows payments. $500 to a man named J.T. Miller, the explosives man. The payment was made the day before Samuel Hale died, and Caleb Hale signed off on it." The room went dead silent. "Sabotage," Judge Sterling said, his voice low and serious. "That's a federal crime, Sheriff. And when it causes a death, it's capital murder." Rakes's face turned a deep shade of red. "That's hogwash. Just a clerk's scribbles." "I have the signed receipt," Arthur shouted, finding his nerve. "Caleb Hale signed it. He paid to have the support beams blown. He killed his own brother for the claim and framed this woman to cover his tracks." Sterling turned his hard gaze on Rakes. "Release her," the judge ordered. "I have a warrant," Rakes growled, his hand near his gun. "And I am the circuit judge for this territory," Sterling thundered back. "I am revoking that warrant. You release her, or I'll have the marshals arrest you for obstruction of justice." Rakes looked from Elias to the judge, then to the clerk. He could feel the ground shifting under him. The story the town had built to protect its powerful folks had just cracked wide open. He pulled the keys from his belt and threw them on the floor. "Unlock it yourself," he spat. Elias scooped up the keys. With shaking hands, he finally got the lock open. The door swung wide. Clara stepped out, her eyes only on Elias. "You came back," she whispered. "Told you I would," Elias said, leaning hard against the bars. "I always come back." Judge Sterling tapped his cane. "I'm setting a hearing for tomorrow morning at the courthouse," he announced. "Mrs. Hale, you will present your evidence. Sheriff, you will inform Mr. Caleb Hale his presence is required. And if any harm comes to this woman or her witness, I will bring the United States Army down on this town." Rakes glared at them all. "You ain't won yet," he hissed. "You think a jury in this town will convict a Hale? You're dreaming." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Elias sagged, his strength gone. Clara caught him. "We have to go," Elias said weakly. "He'll send men." "You're coming with me to the hotel," the judge said. "I have 2 federal marshals. They'll guard your door. Tonight you are under the protection of the United States government." They walked out into the dusty street where a crowd had gathered. Folks watched in silence as the beat-up frontiersman and the widow with her baby walked beside the judge. Clara saw confusion and doubt on their faces. The story was changing, But down the street, she saw a group of men getting on their horses near the saloon. They were heavily armed. She knew right then justice wouldn't come from a courtroom. It would come from a fight. They had lit a fuse, and the explosion was coming tomorrow. Clara held on to Elias's arm tighter. "We're ready," and she said so low only he could hear. He looked at her, his eyes hazy with pain, but burning with that fierce love. "Yes," he said, "we are." The courthouse in Oak Haven was a drafty old box that smelled of dust, stale tobacco, and the sweat of too many people packed inside. It was early December of 1874, and the winter light was gray and mean. The whole town, it seemed, had turned out for the show. They were hungry to see the sinner and the savage mountain man she ran with. Clara Hale sat at a small table up front, her hands clenched tight in her lap. She wore a simple gray dress that didn't quite fit, but she sat with her back straight as a fence post. Elias Mercer sat beside her. He was cleaned up, but a stark white bandage was wrapped around his head. He didn't look at the crowd, just stared at the judge's bench, a muscle jumping in his jaw. The whispers buzzed all around them. "Look at her," a woman hissed. "Not an ounce of shame, Betheshamum. That baby ain't Samuel's," a man muttered. Clara heard every poison-laced word. She realized the law wasn't just about books. It was about the story a town tells itself. And this town's story said a woman who survived on her own must be wicked. Judge Sterling banged his gavel hard. "Order," he bellowed. "This is a court of law, not a saloon." He looked down at the prosecutor, a slick fella named Vance, hired by the Hale family. Vance stood up and smoothed his vest, looking at the 12 men on the jury. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice slick as snake oil. "A good man, Samuel Hale, is dead, and his widow, instead of mourning, ran off into the wilderness with a known violent man. We will prove this was not fear, but guilt." His witnesses were a parade of lies. Mrs. Gable took the stand, her eyes full of venom. "She never cried," she said. "Not once, too proud for a woman living in a shack. She refused charity." "Or refused to let folks see the truth," Vance added smoothly. Next, a man from the saloon lied. "Samuel was afraid of her, told me she had a temper and threatened him." Elias clenched his fists on the table. A man behind him kicked his chair. "Easy there, killer," the fellow whispered. Elias turned slowly and gave the man a look as cold and hard as a blue norther. The man swallowed and looked away. Elias felt Clara's hand on his arm. "Breathe," she whispered. "Don't give them what they want." He let out a long breath. They wanted the savage to snap and prove them right. He wouldn't do it. Then it was Clara's turn. She walked to the witness chair and swore on the Bible. "Mrs. Hale," Judge Sterling asked gently, "why did you run?" Clara looked out at the hostile faces and at Caleb Hale sitting in the front row. "I ran because I wanted to live," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Tell us about your marriage." Clara took a deep breath and laid her private life bare. "Samuel wasn't a monster," she said. "He was a man disappointed by life. He drank to forget he was poor. And when he drank, he got mean. He hit me." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "He hit me because the mine was dry on," she went on. "He hit me because the roof leaked. He hit me because I was there. And you all knew it." She pointed a finger right at the crowd. "You all saw the bruises on my face when I came to market?" Clara's voice cut through the silent courtroom. "You looked away. You sold him the whiskey, then judged me for the noise he made." Vance, the Hale's lawyer, approached her. "You say you were afraid, yet you ran straight to Elias Mercer, a known criminal. Is it not true you plotted with him to get rid of your husband?" Elias shot to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor. "That is a lie," he roared. "He saved my life," Clara cried out. But their outburst only made them look more guilty. The air in the room was thick enough to choke on when the back door creaked open. A miner named Silas Green, covered head to toe in coal dust, walked straight to the judge. "I have got something to say," he announced. "I worked via Samuel Hale, and I saw Caleb Hale at the mine the day before Samuel fell, arguing that the timber supports cost too much." The courtroom went dead quiet. "Samuel told me he had found a big silver vein," Green said, looking at Clara. "He was going to take you and the baby and leave this town for good. That support beam did not rot, Judge. It was sawn through. I saw the sawdust myself." Green held up a piece of paper. "Found this in the foreman's shack," he said. It is a deed, transferring the mine to the Hale family trust the day after Samuel died. The judge took the document and stared at the signature, then looked hard at the clerk, Arthur Penn. Mr. Penn, the judge's voice was low. Is this your hand? Arthur stood, shaking like a leaf. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Hale made me do it. He said if I refused, I would be out of a job. The courtroom exploded. The crowd's anger turned from Clara straight to Caleb Hale. Vance, desperate, shouted over the noise. This changes nothing. The woman is with Elias Mercer, a known firebug and killer. You cannot trust her word. A calm, strong voice cut through the racket from the back of the room. I would be mighty careful who you call trash, counselor. It was Captain Joshua Miller leaning on a cane. Miller, who had led the territorial militia for 20 years, walked to the front, the crowd parting for him like water. I know Elias Mercer, he said, looking at the jury. He served under me in the 6th Cavalry. Vance scoffed. A soldier? That proves nothing. It proves everything, Miller shot back. He nodded at Elias. This man was the best scout I ever had. And as for that barn fire in Wyoming, I know the truth of it. He faced the jury again. Mercer burned that barn because its owner had locked 3 people sick with fever inside to die. Elias went in through the flames and pulled 2 of them out before the roof caved in. He burned his own hands to the bone to do it. The captain's gaze swept over the townsfolk. He took the blame so the rancher would not hunt down the survivors. That is the man he is. He takes the punishment so others do not have to. Clara looked at Elias, whose face was a stone mask. She reached over and took his scarred hand, and he gripped hers back like it was the only thing holding him together. Judge Sterling slammed at his gavel. Court is in recess. Sheriff Rakes, take Mr. Hale into custody for questioning. But the sheriff did not move toward his rich friend. Instead, he lunged for Clara's son. The child is a ward of the state until the verdict. Hand him over. Clara backed away, clutching her baby. No, she cried. Elias stepped between them, solid as an oak tree. Rakes bounced right off him. Get out of my way, Mercer, the sheriff bellowed, as 2 deputies charged with clubs swinging. Elias caught the first club, ripped it from the deputy's hand, and shoved the man back into the jury box. Run, Clara, Elias yelled. The courtroom became a mess of shouting and brawling. Even Captain Miller was using his cane to trip a man trying to grab Elias from behind. Clara ran with her son clutched tight, bursting out of the courthouse into a cold alley. Elias was right behind her, his coat torn. This way, he gasped, and they ran for the hotel. They scrambled up the back stairs to their room, slammed the door, and shoved a dresser against it. Clara collapsed on the bed, trying to catch her breath while the baby cried. Elias peeked through the curtain. They are outside, he said. Rakes is getting the posse together. He knows if he cannot win in court, he will try to win in the street. He turned to her, the fight gone out of him. I should have kept us running, Clara. I led you straight into a trap. She stood up, wet a cloth, and wiped a smear of blood from his cheek. No, she said, her voice steady and hard as iron. I am done running. A strange calm had settled over her, pushing out all the fear. If we run now, Elias, we will run forever. They will take everything from us, including my son. She looked at Elias, who sat with his head in his hands. He spoke so quietly she almost could not hear him. I had a brother, Toby. He followed me into the army, even though he was not built for it. Elias's voice broke. We were pinned down in a cornfield at Antietam. The fighting was fierce. I told him to stay put while I cleared a path. I thought he was right behind me, but he got scared. He stood up to run. Elias closed his eyes, living the horror all over again. I heard the shot. I heard him call my name, but I could not get back to him. The line pushed forward and I had to leave him there. Tears cut through the grime on his face. That is why I went to the mountains. Everyone I try to protect gets hurt. I figured if I stayed away from people, I could not fail them anymore. Clara knelt in front of him and took his face in her hands. The war killed him, Elias, not you. I left him, he whispered. And you found us, she said, her voice firm. You brought my son into this world. You kept us from freezing. You stood up to a whole mob for us. She rested her forehead against his. You are not bad luck, Elias Mercer. You are the only good luck I have ever had. Do not you dare give up now. I need you. Toby is gone, but we are right here. He let out a long, shaky breath and wrapped his arms around her, holding on for dear life. Thank you, he mumbled into her shoulder. A soft knock came at the door. Who is it? Elias called, his hand on his pistol. It is Arthur, a nervous voice whispered back. Elias moved the dresser just enough for the clerk to slip in by, carrying a heavy leather bag. I took it, Arthur said, his eyes wide. When the fight started, Rakes left his saddlebags. He dumped the contents on the bed. It was the mine's main ledger, but there was more. Letters from Caleb Hale to the sheriff, promising him money. Orders to the foreman to sabotage the mine. It is all here, Arthur breathed. Every dirty deal. Clara picked up a letter, her hands shaking with pure fury. This is it, she said. This is how we end them. She looked at Elias, her eyes blazing. Tomorrow, we finish this. Arthur nodded, thanked them, and slipped back out into the hall. Alone again, the cold hotel room felt charged with a new kind of heat. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, they finally had their weapon. That night, Elias looked at Clara standing in the moonlight. He walked over to her, took her face in his hands, and kissed her. This was not a kiss of desperation or fear. It was slow and deep, the kiss of a man reclaiming his life. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him in, wanting only to feel his heartbeat against hers. In the dark of that room, they found a sanctuary in each other. They made love with a fierce intensity, a silent promise that whatever tomorrow brought, they would not be broken. They would face it together. It was a cold morning, the kind that settles deep in your bones, and that courtroom felt like a tomb. A gavel cracked the silence like a gunshot, and everyone knew a good woman, Clara, was about to hang for a crime she did not commit. Judge Sterling stared down from his bench, his face carved from stone. He held a stack of letters that told the real story. He looked at Sheriff Rakes, who was trying his best to look tough, and then at Caleb Hale, whose fancy suit suddenly looked cheap in the dusty light. The whole town was holding its breath. Judge Sterling announced that the court was back in session. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a coming storm. The judge held up a letter. We have new evidence, he said. He read from a paper dated November the 14th, addressed to the foreman at the Blackwood mine. It said, the supports on level 4 are to be weakened. Payment is coming once the shaft is closed. Make sure there are no witnesses. A single gasp sucked the air right out of the room. The letter, Judge Sterling said, is signed by Caleb Hale. Caleb shot up, his face as red as a sunset. That is a lie. She forged it to frame me. Sit down, the judge boomed. He picked up another letter. This one is to Sheriff Rakes. It says the widow is a problem. $500 for a quick solution. $10,000 for a conviction. The judge put the letter down and looked straight at the sheriff. The crowd turned as one, their faces a mix of shock and shame. They had been played for fools, their anger stirred up by a rich man's greed. Men stared at the floor. The town clerk, Arthur Penn, stood up trembling. It is all true, he squeaked. I saw the money change hands. Caleb lunged for him, shouting, You little rat! But Elias was already there. He did not throw a punch. He just stood in Caleb's path like an old oak tree. Caleb bounced right off him and looked up into that scarred, calm face. Sit down, Elias said softly, before you make this any worse. Caleb looked at the faces of his neighbors, saw the disgust, and knew his money was no good here anymore. He crumpled back into his seat for trying to have a man killed. Sheriff Rakes backed away, his hand near his pistol. You ain't got no power over me, Judge. The people elected me. The judge wasn't having it. I am suspending your authority. Surrender your badge. Rakes looked at the crowd, then at Elias. He spat on the floor and ripped the tin star off his chest, throwing it down. Keep it, he said. This town's rotten anyway. He stomped out. The marshals cuffed Caleb, who started yelling for his lawyer. Elias put a hand on Clara's shoulder. It is over, he said. But as Clara looked at the town folks staring, she knew it wasn't. The judge signed a paper. Mrs. Hale, the court recognizes your son's inheritance. The Blackwood mine is his. You are his guardian. It was justice, but it felt hollow. Caleb had money for lawyers, and Rakes was, for now, a free man. Outside, the townfolk just watched them pass. They didn't hate her anymore, But they'd never forgive her for showing them how ugly they could be. "We are leaving," Clara said. "Now." At the hotel, Captain Miller met them. "Y'all need to get gone," he warned. "Rakes is at the saloon, drinking and talking big. He's got some hired guns with him." Miller handed Elias a box of bullets. "Watch your back. A snake is meanest right after you stomp on its tail." They packed in a hurry. The victory in court felt like thin ice. They loaded their wagon and headed out of Oak Haven under a gray sky. The town was dead quiet, like a stage after all the actors had run off. Snow started to fall as they reached a wooden bridge. Elias pulled the horses to a stop. "What is it?" Clara asked, her hand on the pistol he had given her. "Tracks," Elias said, pointing. "Riders crossed here and got off their horses. It is an ambush." He didn't climb down. Instead, he stood up on the wagon seat and yelled, "Rakes, I know you are out there." For a second, there was only wind. Then a gunshot splintered the wood right next to Clara. She threw herself over the baby as Elias dropped to one knee and fired his rifle. A man screamed from the rocks. Rakes stepped out then, holding a shotgun, with 3 other men on the ridge above. "That piece of paper don't stop me," Rakes shouted. "That silver is mine." Elias looked past him to the men on the ridge. "Y'all are fighting for a man with no badge. The marshals are in town. You kill us, you will hang. Is he paying you enough to die for?" 2 of the men lowered their rifles. "Shoot them!" Rakes screamed. One man fired, hitting a wagon horse. The animal screamed and reared up, throwing the wagon sideways. Elias jumped, rolled in the snow, and came up firing, not to kill but to make a point. He shot the rocks near the men. "Run or die!" he roared. The hired guns took one look at Elias and disappeared into the trees. "Cowards!" Rakes yelled. He turned and saw Clara trying to control the horses. He saw his chance and aimed the shotgun right at her. Clara didn't scream. She pulled out her own revolver, just like Elias had taught her. She leveled the big pistol and fired. The shot spun Rakes around and dropped him in the snow, clutching a bloody shoulder. Elias was on him in a second, kicking the shotgun away. He pointed his rifle at Rakes' chest. "Go on," Rakes wheezed. "Be the killer they say you are." The rage was boiling in Elias, but then he heard Clara's voice. "Elias, don't. He is not worth it." Elias looked at the small, broken man bleeding in the dirt and lowered his rifle. He turned his back on Rakes and walked to the wagon. "You are a good shot," he told Clara quietly as he took the pistol from her shaking hands. "I just wanted him to stop," she whispered. "He stopped," Elias said and snapped the reins. They crossed the bridge, leaving Rakes for the marshals to find. They camped that night far from the road. The quiet of the country settled around them, but this time it was the quiet of peace, not hiding. Elias looked at Clara across the fire. "Where to now?" he asked. Clara shook her head at his idea of going back to the cabin. "A child needs a town, a school. He needs to be part of the world." "So, the city?" Elias asked, not liking the thought. "No," Clara said. "Is there a place in between?" "There is a valley," Elias said after a moment. 2 days north. Good water, good timber. We could stake a claim. Make a home." "A home," Clara repeated softly. 2 days later they found it. It was a perfect bowl of golden grass surrounded by mountains. They got to work building a house. It was a hard winter, but they faced it together. He cut the timber, and she chinked the walls. They worked side by side, their grief for the past becoming the mortar that held their new life together. One spring evening, they stood on the porch of their finished home. The baby, now a healthy boy named Samuel, was in Clara's arms. They had built more than a cabin. They had built a future. Months later, Elias leaned on the porch rail of their new home, watching the sunset. Their little boy, Toby, played on a blanket nearby. "It is over," he said. Clara came and stood beside him. The land was theirs now, earned with sweat, not stolen with lies. "Why did you stay with me?" she asked him, her voice quiet. Elias looked at her. "You already know why." "I need to hear you say it," she told him. "I need to know it was not just about duty." He turned to face her, filling up her whole world. "I stayed because of the quiet," he said. "The quiet used to be a peaceful thing. Now when you are not there, it just feels empty. I stayed because when I look at you, I see a sunrise, not the war." He touched her face gently. "I want you, Clara, not to save you. I want you because The idea of waking up and you not being there is worse than any bullet. She let out a breath she had been holding for years. I love you, she whispered. I know, Elias said, pulling her close. And we take that risk. That is what living is. He kissed her then, a promise sealed right there on the porch of the home they built. The seasons changed. They planted a garden and bought a milk cow. It was not an easy life. Some days folks would ride by and stare, but they held their heads high. They were not a scandal. They were a family. And that, my friends, is the story of how Clara and Elias fought for their piece of the world. It was a long, hard road, but I hope y'all felt every step of it right along with them. I would sure love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in the big city, the mountains, or maybe way across the ocean? Go on and leave a comment down below to let me know. If you enjoyed this tale from the wild frontier and you want to hear more stories about survival and love, please make sure you subscribe. And one last thing, what did y'all think of Clara's grit? Was justice really served in that town? Share your thoughts with me in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your powder dry.